Stargate, a novel by Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich. Chapter 14, The Discovery. Everything in this primitive city was rugged, dilapidated, and scarred. The rocky plaster of Daniel's sleeping chamber looked jagged in the uneven candlelight. This background made the girl's smooth, cream-brown skin seem all the more miraculous. She stood there with her robe at her ankles, trembling ever so slightly, looking at Daniel. Neither of them knew exactly what to do next. By the time the shock wore off, Daniel was blushing hotter than a red pepper. He quickly realized what was going on. You don't have to do that," he said, and bent down to retrieve the girl's robe. He could see that this delicate creature was frightened. Obviously, the elders had seen him eyeing her and had decided to give him a gift. Suddenly, he was terribly embarrassed. He had been very indiscreet, and now his infatuation had led to this traumatic episode for this innocent girl. He picked up the robe and went to drape it over her shoulders. But to his surprise, she resisted getting dressed. Although she couldn't understand his words, Daniel tried to explain. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Don't worry. You don't have to go through with this. I mean, I like you, believe me. You're really beautiful. But do you understand?" Eventually, she allowed herself to be wrapped up in the robe. Daniel put an arm around her and tenderly escorted her to the door. He pulled back the curtain, and, just to make sure she understood how much he liked her, he put his hand on her cheek and smiled tenderly. About 100 people, the town elders among them, had gathered on the footbridge just outside, waiting for the outcome of the girl's visit. Another crowd of people were gawking from the balcony of the building across the narrow street. "Kashimanele? Kasufbarta Shauri? Kashi!" The girl tried explaining something to the old man, but he flew off the handle, angrily shaking his finger and yelling at her. The girl gave up trying to explain, hung her head, and started sobbing. Kasuf turned to Daniel, suddenly humble and pleasant. He started apologizing rapidly in his language, afraid the girl had done something to displease their esteemed guest. Groveling theatrically, he came forward until he grabbed the girl by the wrist, intending to drag her off. In a flash, Daniel had her free hand and was pulling her back toward him. He wrapped an arm around her shoulder and smiled his biggest, brightest smile. "Just wanted to say," he fumbled for words, to say thanks. Yes, that's it. Thank you so much. I couldn't be more pleased. It's a really weird thing for you to do, but the point I'm trying to make here is thank you, thank you, thank you." He knew these people couldn't understand his words, but perhaps he would understand his tone of voice. The crowd stared back at him uncomprehendingly as he pushed the girl back inside. "Good night now." He pulled the curtains closed and breathed a sigh of relief. The last thing he wanted was to get this girl in trouble. He turned and looked at her. "Sorry about that." A look of surprise flashed across her face. A moment later, she was untying her robe once more. No, that's okay." Daniel motioned for her to stop, and, completely confused, she did. He signaled for her to sit down on the bed, which she did. He crossed the room until he was a comfortable distance away and sat down with his back against the wall. They looked at each other. Daniel smiled. The girl smiled. Then they looked at each other some more. Since the moment Daniel had laid eyes on her, he'd wanted nothing more than to be close to her, to spend some quiet time learning to overcome their linguistic and cultural differences. Now that opportunity was here. He didn't know what to say. Kowalski, Brown, and O'Neill had been taken to quarters on the far side of the same building. Each was given a separate room radiating off a common parlor. They had gathered in the parlor, the only room with windows, for 30 minutes. Brown had been working the radio equipment, trying every trick he knew to raise Ferretti and the others. O'Neill stood at one of the windows where he could see the storm beating against the huge walls that circled the city. With his back turned to the others, O'Neill was absently rolling something around between his fingers. It was the orange key of the equipment cart. When the curtains covering the main entryway opened, O'Neill quickly pocketed the key. Kowalski unholstered his pistol. They had a visitor. It was Skara, who was starting to make it his business to go everywhere O'Neill went. His desire to stick close to the colonel put him in a minority of one. The people of Nagata, like O'Neill's own soldiers, sensed dangerous unpredictability oozing from the man in the black beret, and had tried to keep their distance. Everyone, that is, except this kid, the first person O'Neill had frightened. Now he was following him everywhere, studying his every move. As soon as he was in the room, Skara hurried to a corner and sat down against the wall, showing he wouldn't be any trouble. Kowalski looked at O'Neill, who nodded that it was okay for the boy to stay. During the banquet, O'Neill had noticed the teenager sitting in the shadows, watching. And that's what he was doing right now. O'Neill left Brown and Kowalski, walking into his private chamber, where he sat down in one of the uncomfortable chairs. The boy, afraid but determined to act fearlessly, came into the room and sat down a few feet away. O'Neill, ignoring the kid, took a cigarette out of his pack and lit it. When the flame shot out of the lighter, the boy nearly jumped out of his skin. Nevertheless, when he'd caught his breath, he reached over and pulled a cigarette out of O'Neill's pack, mimicking the colonel's movements, pretending to smoke. "Lighter," O'Neill pronounced the word carefully, then tossed the Zippo to Skara. The boy lit the thing several times, fascinated, before clumsily lighting the end of his cigarette. Casting a sidelong glance at the boy, O'Neill flicked the ash from his cigarette. Skara did the same. The two of them sat there for a moment. Skara was starting to feel pretty damn confident. He was, after all, the only one hanging out with these remarkable visitors. O'Neill saw the boy's cockiness and couldn't resist. He took a long drag on his cigarette, then inhaled deeply. With a wise guy smirk on his face, Skara went through the same motion, but the split second the hot smoke reached his lungs, his eyes bulged wide open. He came up, gagging. He doubled over and staggered across the room until he crashed into the bed, the fire in his throat and nose getting worse as he coughed. Brown and Kowalski could hear the kid coughing, but decided not to go investigate. When he could, Skara propped himself against the bed and threw the foul little thing on the floor, never to smoke again. "Good idea," said the colonel, extinguishing his own smoke, then coming across the room to ground out the one the boy had thrown. When he looked up, he got an ugly surprise. The boy, his eyes full of water, was reaching for the pistol he'd seen O'Neill fire that afternoon near the city's main gate. Just as the curious young man's fingers touched the barrel of the gun, he heard O'Neill boom, "No! Dangerous!" O'Neill pinned the boy's hand on the bed, knocking the gun away. Then he deliberately slapped Skara's hand, slapped it hard. Kowalski and Brown came around the corner in time to see O'Neill, the pistol in one hand, shaking the kid with the other, saying, "No, no, no, no!" The moment O'Neill turned him loose, Skara darted for the door and escaped. The colonel followed him across the room and pulled the curtains open and watched him flee. When the boy was gone, O'Neill sat down on the rock-hard bed they'd given him and concentrated on cleaning his pistol. His encounter with Skara had surprised him. They had actually played together, something O'Neill hadn't done in quite some time. And just as he expected, his thoughts began drifting back to Earth and his own son. Even before Jack Jr. was born, O'Neill began to change. Not only did he start feeling happier and more alive, but for the first time that he could remember, he actually began looking forward to coming home. The birth was the most rewarding thing he'd ever been a part of. At the same time, his enthusiasm for Jump 2 slowly began to die. He was losing his taste for bloodshed and violence. The afternoon of his son's 6th birthday party had been a crucial day. Standing behind his son at the head of the table, excitedly helping the boy rip into his presents, O'Neill looked up and caught Sarah smiling at him. An intense feeling of gratitude flooded into him out of nowhere. He realized that he was no longer the angry, empty kid he had been while growing up. The boy that would hurt people and things because he didn't know any other way to be. Sarah had done this for him, and even though they'd already been married for a long time, he suddenly understood that he owed this woman his life. The next morning, he walked into the staff sergeant's office and told them he wanted out of Jump 2. At first, his superiors refused. O'Neill was the team's go-to guy, the best soldier in this elite fighting squad. But he was adamant, and eventually, rather than drive him from the armed services altogether, they gave him an instructor's position at the Marine Corps training facility at Yuma. They warned him, however, that Special Forces personnel of his caliber never really retired. Someday he would be called upon for another mission. Of course, he hadn't imagined it would lead him to anything like his present assignment, especially after he'd been tossed out of the service. By the time the boy, JJ, was 12, he and his dad were best friends. As a player-coach combo, they became the perennial team to beat at the local Little League. The only disturbing thing was that somehow, despite his father's transformation, the boy had inherited the same wildness of heart O'Neill had. He started getting into more and more trouble at school, crossing the line between rowdy and violent. Sarah was concerned about it, but when she tried to bring the subject up, the two men closed ranks. They would exchange smirking smiles, members of the house's boys-only club. Remembering how he'd indulged the boy's recklessness, O'Neill sighed loudly enough to attract the attention of Kowalski and Brown. O'Neill banged his head backward against the wall. He didn't do this violently, but it was more than enough to draw stares from the two soldiers at the window. Brown turned to Kowalski, and trying to keep the question as light as possible, asked, "Is it just me, or is there something really wrong with that guy?" "Just follow his orders," Kowalski said. "He must have been put in charge for a good reason." Brown stared back at him for a minute before asking, "You really believe that?" They had been sitting there staring at each other for an awfully long time before Daniel felt the need to try talking. He cleared his throat like he was about to call a meeting to order, then introduced himself to the angel sitting stiffly on his bed. "I'm Daniel. Daniel." "Dan-dur?" she asked. "No, Dan-yer. Me, Daniel," he enunciated carefully, pointing to himself. She smiled tentatively and nodded. "Dan-yer," she repeated before pointing to herself and saying, "Showery." "Showery. Okay, Showery. Hi." After another awkward pause, Daniel went on. "We came from the pyramid." He looked at her. "You know, pyramid, 4 equal sides converging to a single apex. You're probably not going to like this, but I'm going to draw you a picture." He raced his forefinger through the sand on the floor, outlining the shape, then looked up at her expectantly. Showery turned her head and averted her eyes. I know, you're not allowed." Frustrated, he stood up and walked to the far side of the room, put his forehead against the wall, and went on talking. "What is it with you people? I mean, I've heard of graphophobia, but this is ridiculous. Anyway, you're obviously not going to be able to help us find what we need, so I should just give it a rest, right?" Showery sensed how frustrated he was. She took a deep breath and a huge risk. When Daniel turned around, she was leaning over the drawing he had made, augmenting it. Daniel came back across the room to see what she was doing. Across the peak of the pyramid, she drew a fine line, and above that, a circle. It was the same sign Daniel had found on the cover stones, the 7th symbol that had cracked the code to the Stargate. "That's the sign for Earth. Do you know this symbol?" Showery looked up at Daniel, suddenly very nervous. She had broken one of her people's fundamental laws, a violation that could have led to her immediate execution. Since she wasn't dead already, she calculated that Daniel wasn't an agent sent by the gods to test the city. But now she had another problem. She had to communicate the extreme danger of the situation to him. She knew he'd want to know more, but she couldn't help him any further until he understood how dangerous reading and writing were. With Showery holding a torch and showing him the way, Daniel pulled the hood of the robe she'd found for him low over his face. As they stole furtively through the winding streets, Daniel realized that Nagata was built on a slope. They were nearing the corrals where the 100 or so mastages were kept penned up at night. They were perfuming the evening with the pungent aroma of fresh dung. The back perimeter wall of the compound loomed in the distance. Then Shaori stopped at a tall stone building with a doorway defined by a graceful lancet arch. She pulled him by the sleeve into the pitch-black atrium, where the torches flickering threw just enough light into the recesses of the abandoned structure for Daniel to see that it was probably once a covered marketplace, but now, judging from the intense smell of manure, acted as a commodious compost heap. Daniel's eyes began to tear up under the assault of the biting, acrid stench. Taking him deeper into the squalid darkness, Shaori showed him a stone staircase that led down to a dead end. Whatever door might have once stood at the bottom of these stairs had long since been blocked over with large stones. Nevertheless, they descended. About halfway down, Shaori passed the torch to Daniel and reached into the gap between the stairs and into the wall. She loosened a hidden retaining pin, then pushed one of the stone slabs out of the way, revealing a narrow opening, just enough space for them to slide through. Once they were inside, they found themselves in the basement of the building in a thick forest of beams that rose up to support the wooden floor above them. Low corridors ran off in several directions. Shaori took the torch from Daniel and led him into one of these dank passages. She hadn't been down there since she was a girl, but after only a couple of wrong turns, she brought them to the top of another narrow staircase. This one was very ancient, and carved from a single large stone that had begun to crumble in several places. At the bottom of these stairs, they found themselves in a square earthen cell. More tunnels twisted away into the darkness, but Shaori brought the torch close to the wall. Filthy with years of dust and grime, and illuminated the symbol for Earth, sun over pyramid. Astonished, Daniel came to the wall and reached out to touch it. It had been carefully carved an inch deep into a smooth section of the stone wall. It was the only writing in the room. Daniel thought for a minute, and then noticed that all the walls were made of roughly cut stone, all except the area around the symbol. On a hunch, he began brushing the centuries of dirt away from the lone hieroglyph until he found what he was looking for: a crevice. The sign was cut into the middle of a door. He scraped away as much dirt as he could from between the door and jamb. He wedged his fingers into the space, prying at it with all he was worth. He managed to budge it open about half an inch. Shaori propped the torch against the wall and lent her fingers, as strong as Daniel's, to the effort. Finally, the door swung open. Daniel pushed the torch through the doorway. Oh my God. Daniel couldn't believe what he was looking at. There was a narrow hallway 5 feet tall and approximately 50 feet long. Every inch of it was jammed with Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. The long-dead language he could read and write fluently. There were portraits, painted scenes, etchings, and carved reliefs in the classic frontalism style, but mainly there was text, long scripts of hieroglyphic writing chiseled into the walls. Daniel thought he must have died and gone to Egyptologist heaven. Shaori had led him into a lush forest of mysterious signs, probably the most densely written and rewritten palimpsest ever. An intense, convoluted puzzle that, despite its jumbled Talmudic format, was executed with religious care, giving the room a shrine quality. Daniel licked his lips and waded deeper into the room. Shaori couldn't believe it either. Like everyone in Nagata, she vaguely knew what writing was, even though she couldn't do it. As a child, she and her friends had invented several symbols and written each other notes in the sand, but when they were discovered, they were punished very severely. In her world, there was no need for writing. There were no books, street signs, or spelling bees. They had stories, of course, but only ones that were spoken. Once a song or a story was forgotten, it was lost forever. Before stepping into this small corridor, she had absolutely no idea that this galaxy of symbols existed. She couldn't comprehend how utterly complex the rules for understanding them must be. She looked at Daniel with new eyes. Was he a wizard that he could interpret and make these marks? Obviously he was. Holding the torch to the wall, he'd already been able to discern that every entry told a story. The earliest were large historical tableaux. Generations of historians who came later found whatever space was left and shaped their stories to fit the empty spots. Most of the writing moved right to left, but some of it went in the opposite direction. Where necessary, the script ran top to bottom, while in other places it was written in the style called boustrophodon, the back-and-forth format that meant literally an ox travels back and forth when plowing the fields. This riot of writing, this colorful cacophony of characters taken together, was a semiotic treasure chest, a cave full of archaeological loot. It was the ancient history of the people of this world. Daniel isolated the cave's original story, told in relatively large pictures sculpted directly into the wall, then painted over. It was not an uplifting tale. The first panel depicted several of the tutelary gods, the same anthropomorphized animal deities worshipped in ancient Egypt. They were tearing children from the grasps of their screaming mothers, herding them away across the desert. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, seemed to be supervising the work of the other gods. Horus the hawk was present, as was Thoth, the baboon-headed deity of words and magic, the one who recorded the names of the dead in the underworld. The scene shifted to some kind of battle or civil uprising, and then the people were shown in chains floating over the desert, as if in a collective dream. When they woke, they fell to the ground where the gods and their warriors brutalized the people, forcing them through a Stargate. Daniel studied the hieroglyphic writing surrounding the pictures. The grammatical elements were definitely related to the writing he'd found on the cover stones, but the symbols before him were even more rudimentary. No one on Earth had spoken the language of the ancient Egyptians since the last temples were ordered closed by the Christian Emperor Theodosius I in 391 AD. Since the hieroglyphs left behind on temple walls and papyrus scrolls was written in consonants only, linguistic researchers could only speculate about the vowel structure. Several top-notch Egyptologists, Daniel included, had developed pronunciation schemes, but they were all largely guesswork. Daniel, never afraid to venture a guess, started reading the signs aloud. Holding the torch, he moved close to a section of the glyph-cluttered wall and began. Nadas yan tu yiwa, suma eme rama yedat. It was a story about moving across a desert, a population migrating not out of choice, but by force. Shaori watched and listened carefully. As Daniel read the signs on the wall, she tried to see the connection between the painted symbols and the sounds he was making. Nanda sikma tiyu nane ashe, Daniel continued. Sikma? Shaori asked. The word had caught her attention. Daniel whipped his head around and looked at her. Was she trying to communicate? Had he stumbled across a word she understood? In her language, Sikma was the word meaning children. Over Daniel's shoulders, she could see a picture carved into the wall, a scene of many people being herded like animals. Many of the figures were clearly intended to represent children. Sikma, she said again. Sikma? Daniel asked urgently, pointing to the hieroglyph for children. Shaori looked at the symbol, which held no meaning for her. Sikma, she said, pointing to the illustration on the wall, singling out the children. Yes, he yelled. Yes, Sikma, children, of course. Daniel's suspicion had been right all along. Shaori and her people spoke a dialect of ancient Egyptian, and by a stroke of sheer luck, they had stumbled across the word Sikma, which had changed little over the centuries. Excited, Daniel immediately found another symbol, the one for God. Nefer. This time the written symbol was more abstract. The glyph consisted of an eye over two feathers. Shaori looked at the symbol, but couldn't immediately guess its meaning. Nephir? Naifar? Daniel asked, then showed her the picture of Anubis and several other animal deities who were herding the humans across the desert. Neumifar, Shaori yelled, as if she had just won a round of charades. Nayum-Ifar, Daniel asked, realizing how radically different their pronunciations were. He practiced saying the word several times, quickly bringing his ancient in line with hers. He was doing it. He was speaking the dead language of the pharaohs, a language he had been looking at for many years. Shaori said the word several times, carefully enunciating each syllable, teaching Daniel to say it the way she did. Yes, he was agog. Teach me to speak, teach. Takira? Shaori, Takira, Daniel, okay? Shaori Takiyer Daniel. It was the first time in her life that a man had openly asked her to teach him. Shaori swelled with pride. This man, with all his exotic skills, was asking her for instruction. It was the first moment of her transformation. For his part, Daniel was smiling like he had died and gone to heaven with this beautiful woman assigned to be his guide, and it wasn't even midnight yet. According to the watch on O'Neill's wrist, it was 8:21 p.m., Rocky Mountain time. But beyond the city's fortress walls, the first of the day's 3 suns was dawning on the horizon. The storm was over, and the dark sky looked utterly clear. O'Neill stood at one of the parlor room's windows next to Brown, who had set the radio on the sill, and was trying to re-establish contact with Ferretti in total disregard of whether the neighbors might still be sleeping. He had a big, strong voice to begin with, and now that he was frustrated and starting to fear for the base camp team, it became even stronger. Finally, he turned to O'Neill. No use. I can't raise them. What are you getting? More interference? No, he replied. Nothing but dead air. There should at least be a tracking signal, but I'm not getting anything. Colonel, the shout came from outside. O'Neill crossed the room and stepped out onto one of the many rope and lumber footbridges suspended between the buildings. In the shadowy street below, he could make out the vague outline of his lieutenant. Jackson's not in his room, Kowalski called up. I've been looking everywhere, but I can't find him. What is that you're holding? His jacket, Kowalski answered, obviously peeved about having to carry it around for his royal professorship. O'Neill looked out at the horizon where the night sky was melting to purple morning. They could feasibly leave now for the pyramid, but O'Neill decided to wait for dull daylight. He estimated it would be another half an hour before they had full visibility. The colonel figured Daniel was most likely out collecting wildflowers and writing poetry, but there was the odd chance something very good or very bad had happened. If that was the case, he wanted to know about it. They could afford 30 minutes of looking for him, no more. 2 minutes later, O'Neill was downstairs. He and Kowalski were following their noses toward the sharp smell coming off from the mastage corral. They spotted Skara sitting on the fence surrounded by a handful of other kids. Skara still had O'Neill's lighter. He felt he had earned the right to brag about his encounter with the aliens, and that's exactly what he was doing, firing up the lighter and retelling the story of how he'd gotten it. Nabe, the crazy-looking shepherd with the big head and wild teeth, kept trying to touch the flame, even though Skara warned him not to. Nabe, older and slower than the other boys, was Skara's sidekick and devoted pal. The boys scattered when they saw the 2 soldiers walking toward them, all except Skara, even though he was as frightened as many of them. He knew firsthand how unpredictable and violent the man in the black beret could be. Skara sat on the fence without flinching. Wait here, O'Neill told Kowalski. He walked over to the boy by himself. He leaned against the corral fence and watched the big woolly mastiches work out some of their morning energy by racing around the corral. He wanted to tell the kid that he was sorry about slapping him the night before, that he'd done it strictly out of concern for the boy's safety, and if he'd overreacted, he at least had plenty of reason to do so because of everything he'd been going through for the past couple of years. But O'Neill, even if he spoke the boy's language, wouldn't have been able to dive that far into his own feelings without starting to drown. Instead, he stood there quietly watching the mastiches sprint through the cold morning air. When he looked over at the boy, Skara lit up an imaginary cigarette, took a deep drag, and then exhaled visibly into the frosty morning air. The kid was letting him off the hook, showing him there were no hard feelings. "I'm looking for Jackson," O'Neill said to the boy, who of course didn't understand. "See? Jackson." He held up the jacket, but still got no glimmer. The other boys began edging their way closer. How could the colonel get his message across to them? Speaking slowly and too loudly, he explained, "We're looking for Jackson." O'Neill made circles with his hands and held them over his eyes, imitating a pair of glasses. The boys copied his movement, cupping their hands over their eyes and laughing. "No, I mean," O'Neill pretended to sneeze. "Oh!" Scar suddenly understood and pointed to O'Neill. "Buck, buck, buck, buck!" in a fairly good imitation of Daniel's chicken sounds. They all understood at once. All the boys quickly joined in like a choir of chickens. "Yeah, that's right. Chicken Man. Where's Chicken Man?" O'Neill said, happy to have finally made some connection with these kids. Scar took Daniel's jacket from O'Neill, then yelled some type of command to the animals. A moment later, the mangiest member of the herd, Little Bit, came trotting over to the fence, neighing like a truck motor badly in need of oil. Scar held the jacket up to the mastige's nose. When Daniel's smell penetrated the beast's giant nostrils, it suddenly reared up on its thin but powerful hind legs and let out a roar that woke up half the city. Scar shouted for Nabe to let her out. As soon as the gate was open, the big ox came barreling out of the corral at a furious clip. She was half a block away before Scar led the boys in pursuit of the animal. "Smart boy," O'Neill said. A cracked and faded pyramid hovered in the sky, rays of light as bright as the sun shooting from its underside. Below, the deteriorating image of a boy king attired in full pharaonic regalia extended his arms to bathe in the light. At his feet, several of ancient Egypt's animal-headed gods were kneeling, their heads bowed in supplication. Daniel scratched his chin, thinking. He was sure now that this sequence of paintings had come first. Whoever the original historian to come down into these catacombs had begun with this story, the strange coronation of this boy king. Shaori was leaning against the opposite wall, doing her best to stay awake and help Daniel with the work. She'd never seen anything like the incredible concentration he brought to this task. "Barai Bidi Pish?" he asked her. "Shana? Shana?" "Chanada." She gave him the pronunciation. "Chanada sedma misna no mirnas? Chanada sedma mirnas, min?" "Min," she said with a smile. "Looks like you found what you were looking for," a voice came from the darkness. Shaori gasped, and Daniel, caught completely by surprise, thrust the torch wildly in the direction of the voice. It was O'Neill stooping to walk under the narrow chamber's low ceiling, with Kowalski right behind him. "You scared the hell out of me," Daniel yelled, his heart thumping like mad. "How'd you get down here?" "I thought you didn't speak their language," O'Neill said hotly, coming deeper into the chaotically painted passageway. "It's ancient Egyptian," Daniel said. "But like the rest of their culture, it's evolved independently. But once you know the vowels, take into account the neutralization of aspiration, the loss of apical and final consonants—" "Give it to me in English, Jackson." "I just had to learn how to pronounce it. It hasn't been a living spoken language in more than 1,000 years. "This place is a damn trip," said Brown, coming around the corner with a powerful flashlight. "It looks like King Tut's tomb, but got turned into a subway station full of graffiti." O'Neill was interested in only one thing. "What does it say in here, Jackson?" Exhilarated, eager to explain what he had learned, Daniel moved across the ride of hieroglyphs like a kid in a candy store. It's simply unbelievable. These walls tell the story of the original settlers of this planet. These people came through the Stargate some 10,000 years ago, it says. Daniel walked up to a long series of drawings and hieroglyphs, tracing his finger quickly over the etchings. "A traveler from distant stars escaped from a dying world looking for a way to extend his own life. His body was decaying and weak, yet with all his powers and knowledge he could not prevent his own demise. Daniel paraphrased. Apparently his whole species was becoming extinct, so he searched the galaxies looking for a way to cheat death. Look here. Again, Daniel rushed over to another series of drawings. As O'Neill listened to Daniel, he became lost in the story. It was as though O'Neill could completely visualize every word Daniel said. The visions did not so much surprise O'Neill, but confirmed something deep within his darkest worries. He listened intently as Daniel continued. It says he came to a world rich with life, where he encountered a primitive race, perfect for his needs. Humans, a species he could repair and maintain indefinitely. He realized with a human body he had a chance for a new life. That's when he found the boy. Daniel moved over to a series of strange drawings, etched crudely with a flying pyramid hovering over a human, shielding his eyes from the bright light. Around the drawing, several other people running away. Daniel pointed to the figure beneath the pyramid. He came to some kind of village. It says that the villagers ran, frightened as the night became day, but one young boy walked toward the light. Curious and without fear, he walked into a trap. Ra took this boy and possessed him. It's like some kind of parasite looking for a host. Transposed into this human form, he appointed himself ruler of all mankind, the original pharaoh, Ra the sun god. This was the part O'Neill had been waiting to hear. Slowly he moved closer, examining the drawings as Daniel went on. Using the Stargate, Ra, or Rieyu, as they pronounced it, brought thousands of people here to this planet as workers for the quartz mines, just like the one we saw. Clearly this quartz mine mineral found here is the building block of all his technology. Only with this could he sustain eternal life. But something happened back on Earth, a rebellion or uprising. After hundreds of years of oppression, the people waited until Ra was here, on this side of the gate. Then they revolted, overtaking Ra's guardian war gods, and they buried the Stargate so Ra could not return. Fearful that a rebellion could happen here on this world, Ra outlawed reading and writing. He didn't want the people here to remember the truth. These drawings here are the only record they have, and none of them can read it. It's amazing. When Daniel was finished, he waited for O'Neill to respond, but he didn't say anything, didn't move. He only stared at the wall, a faraway look of concentration on his face. Jackson, I think you better come over here. Kowalski had taken the flashlight and was exploring farther down the shaft. Tell me if this is... Just get over here. The guy sounded so excited about whatever it was. Shaori automatically got up to see what it was. Kowalski was only about 10 yards away from the group, but with the low ceiling, the darkness, and the torches, it was tough getting to him. It wasn't a place for claustrophobics. Kowalski had gone around a corner and found the corridor's dead end. Enshrined in sacred writing on all sides stood a single thin stone pillar with a vertical cartouche. Even though it was partially buried in the sand, Kowalski could see how similar it was to the one that ran down the center of the coverstones. Daniel could too. As soon as he turned the corner and saw the shrine, he knew they'd found what they needed to operate the Stargate. They must have kept this here, hoping that one day the gate on Earth could be reopened, Daniel said, then poked the torch close to the tablet and tried to read the cartouche. He didn't understand a single character, which was encouraging. That probably meant they were constellations as seen from wherever this place was in the universe. Damn! He suddenly remembered something. My notebook is back there in my room. I made a list of all the signs on the... Your jacket, sire. Kowalski unceremoniously shoved the jacket at Daniel, who then went to work on digging out the lowest couple of symbols from the moist sand. Daniel consulted his notes. Sure enough, the top symbol on the cartouche matched one of those on his list. We've got it, Daniel proclaimed. The symbols match. Problem. Big problem. Kowalski was grave. Flash and torchlight converged on the big soldier, then moved down to the bottom of the cartouche. The last symbol was gone. broken off. Where's the seventh sign? Kowalski got frustrated and started scooping up rough handfuls of dank soil, throwing them aside. Daniel stopped him quickly and took control of the excavation process. He dug carefully along the base of the wall until he found the fragmented remains of the seventh symbol, one piece at a time. They spent a long time trying to fit the pieces together. All they needed was enough of the symbol to distinguish it from the others on the Stargate's wheel. After 20 minutes, they realized it was useless. Either the tablet had been intentionally broken, or it had simply been eroded by too many years in the sand. There was no trace of the last symbol. Daniel and the soldiers were stunned. There was a feeling that their incredible string of good luck had finally ended. It seemed appropriate that they were gathered around the tunnel's dead end. Now the team had 2 chances of ever getting home, slim and none. It was a long time before anyone spoke. The seventh sign is supposed to be the point of origin, right? O'Neill asked. Ask the girl. Maybe she knows the sign for this planet. Showery, watching the scene unfold, guessed what the colonel must be asking and shook her head. Daniel put the question to her anyway, then turned to O'Neill. No good. She can't write anything except the name of Ra. In that case, we're heading back to the pyramid. O'Neill stood up and took the torch from Showery. When none of the others got to their feet, he made himself clear. We leave immediately. Don't you understand? I can't make it work without the last symbol, Daniel shouted at him. But O'Neill didn't even look back.